Hello everyone, this module is about taking a closer look at the evidence. When we talk about the evidence, aka the research studies you find in the literature is comprised of both quantitative and qualitative study designs. The study design should match the research question being asked. If the purpose of the research question is to show an association between variables being studied, the relationship between an exposure and an outcome, then you're looking for a quantitative design. For example, in hospitals where nurses undergo an educational program on spine health, is there reduced incidence of back injury among nurses? Quantitative designs gather data in numbers which are then statistically analyzed. Quantitative research is the only type of research that can prove causation. Doing X caused Z to happen. Not all quantitative study designs prove causation, but they can tell us things such as odds, relative risk, or the rate of occurrence of an outcome as a result of an exposure. If the purpose of the question is to understand the human experience, how people feel, or what motivates them to behave in a certain way, then we use a qualitative design to study that question. Data for these designs are captured in words using methods such as focus groups and interviews. Words are not statistically analyzed as in quantitative research, but researchers use coding methods to analyze that data for meaning. Neither type of research is better than the other. It is just relatively better depending on the type of question being asked. The two types of research often complement each other to provide a holistic view of the situation. Your assignment focuses on quantitative research, and that will be the emphasis of the modules in my discussions. Every study design has the potential for bias to corrupt the results or truth of a study. The evidence pyramid is commonly used to graphically represent the strength of the different types of quantitative study designs as they relate to their potential for bias. As you go up the pyramid, the strength of the study design increases. The pyramid shape also represents the fact that there are more studies available in the literature at the lower level than at the top. This pyramid can also be divided into primary research studies and secondary research studies. Beginning with randomized controlled trials and below are the primary studies. Primary studies are original research articles published by the authors. The randomized controlled trial is the strongest primary design, as it is the only design that can show definitive cause and effect. Secondary research studies have some manner of appraisal for their EBP value. A systematic review appraises all available studies on a given EBP question. As I mentioned before, it is important to take a comprehensive look at the research. A systematic review does just that. Think of it as a strength in numbers. 10 studies that indicate similar results is stronger than one study indicating that result. A systematic review of randomized controlled trials would be the strongest evidence. The meta-analysis is an additional level of analysis in that it provides a statistical application to multiple studies in order to view the compiled studies as if they were one, statistically. Oftentimes, you find a systematic review with a meta-analysis, such as those produced by the Cochrane Library. We'll take a closer look at the Cochrane database of systematic reviews in a future module. Cochrane review protocols are considered the gold standard of systematic reviews. This particular pyramid has situated the practice guidelines at the top. You'll see other pyramids where it'll place it above, say, the randomized controlled trial. Pyramids do vary, and thinking over time has varied. And as critical appraisal methods have improved, particularly with regard to practice guidelines where they now have a very standardized evaluation method, the guidelines have, in many pyramids, been moved to the top. Basically, the guidelines are issued based on the appraisal of the strongest evidence available on a given topic, whatever the level of evidence may be. These are issued by professional governing associations such as the American Cancer Society, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and such. Let's take a closer look at some of those quantitative primary studies. As mentioned before, randomized controlled trials are considered the strongest studies. They use a tightly controlled experimental design in which the researcher is manipulating the independent variable, aka the exposure. The randomization of the study participants into groups, some who will be exposed to the independent variable and some who will not, allows for the study to prove cause and effect. Sometimes randomization is not possible, but the researchers are still manipulating that independent variable, and it is considered a quasi-experimental design. This study is weaker than an RCT. Studies of an experimental design are stronger than studies that are considered observational. With observational designs, researchers do not control the participants' exposure to the variables being studied, but are making observations. Participants have already had an exposure. They do not prove cause and effect, but seek to establish a causal association or to identify risk factors. Observational studies that have comparison groups can either be cohort studies, case control studies, or cross-sectional studies, depending on the timing of the exposure and the outcome. A cohort study studies a group of individuals, a cohort, who have had an exposure of interest over time to see if the outcome of interest develops. They are compared to a cohort that has not had the exposure but are otherwise similar to see if an association develops to establish the exposure as a risk factor for the outcome. Cohort studies are usually prospective studies going in a forward direction, although they can be done retrospectively using medical records. The thing to remember is that a cohort study is viewed from the vantage point that people have already had an exposure and are looking to see the outcome. Case control studies begin with a group of cases, individuals that have already experienced an outcome, it could be a disease or a condition, and are compared to a control group without the outcome but are similar in all other respects. They examine odds ratios to see if an association can be established between the exposure and the outcome. These are retrospective studies looking backward. Cross-sectional studies do not have control groups, but look at the entire population studied at a specific point in time, providing a snapshot of the prevalence of outcomes and exposures at that time. And from the bottom level of our pyramid, we have our case studies. There are no comparison groups with these studies. They are just observations of individual persons, not groups of people. But they spark an interest into a phenomenon. Sometimes you'll see several similar case studies called a case series. So you might be thinking, well, why not just use the strongest study design? Well, often interest starts at the lowest level. Observations are being made at the individual level, and then several individual cases are popping up with similar results. This sparks interest to do a formalized study. An RCT is a huge investment of time and money. A lower level study might be more appropriate level to begin. The evidence from such a study might support the undertaking of further study at a higher level. An RCT is not always an appropriate design for certain types of questions. And we'll look at this more as we get into future modules. There is a lot more to know about study designs, but they go beyond the scope of the library lesson. This foundation is sufficient for us to begin formulating our clinical questions and using the database limiters. This concludes this module. If you have any questions, please contact me.